Raw TV Public Affairs presentation.
Voice of BC goes off for a few weeks vacation and nothing much happened. Oh yeah, there's a new Liberal leader, a guy named Wilkinson. Oh yeah, there's new rules on selling pot. Yeah, there's a battle with Alberta over oil and, well actually it's a war. But other than that, nothing's happened, so sit right back and we'll fill you in.
And good evening and welcome to a new season of Voice of BC. And yes, a few things have happened since we did the last live show back in December. And yes, in order to get caught up, we've got my two favorite panelists on the show. Justine Hunter from the Globe and Mail. Good to have you back.
Thank you. It's a quiet little legislature.
And
nothing much ever happens.
There you go. And Keith Baldrey from Global TV, who's taking a break between live hits on Global, where you've been doing something about every 5 minutes.
Lots of stuff happening out there.
Yeah.
Great to be here.
Let's talk about the war. And I mean, the rhetoric on this is over the top, and there have been a lot of jokes about it, but British Columbia and Alberta are engaged in a trade war of sorts. Bring us up to speed on it, Keith.
Well, yeah, Rachel Notley, I think, caught everybody by surprise. This out-of-the-blue decision to ban the importation of BC wine into Alberta because the BC government has just simply talked about bringing in a regulation that would limit or control the flow of bitumen through any pipeline through BC. So nothing's actually happened on BC's end. They put out a news release. They want to go out and consult with the public on what they think of this. But suddenly, out of the blue, Notley announces a sanction, catches everybody off guard. John Horgan, BC Premier, won't take the bait. He's not going to retaliate. And I know today a couple Liberal federal cabinet ministers making the point to the media that the Kinder Morgan pipeline is approved. It's their jurisdiction. It's going to go ahead. Sort of language that I think is music to the ears of Rachel Notley, but I'm not sure it really changes much at the end of the day. We still have this trade war going on.
Give me the political overview from the two provinces, because I think both of them have their own political reasons for doing what they're doing.
Yeah, I mean, we know going back to the last time we were here, we were talking about the Site C decision, and the government had made a difficult decision around approving that dam at the cost of annoying a whole bunch of its environmental faction. I think perhaps the trade-off was that they were going to go more aggressively on Kinder Morgan, so they've come up with this idea. It is consultation, but I think the rub for Alberta is this idea that BC would regulate a ban on expanded oil shipments across the province until they get the answers they want on whether we can clean up an oil spill. And it's that idea of saying that BC will be willing to close the gates on this without the federal government having any say in it. That's really sort of triggered the reaction out of Alberta. Obviously, Rachel Notley, going into an election next spring, needs to get some shovels in the ground. That was the trade-off she made in terms of approving changes around climate action was, well, we're going to get a pipeline. That was the deal with Ottawa. And she wants Justin Trudeau to wade into this to try and enforce federal jurisdiction. And BC says they say they've got a legal opinion that allows them to do what they're doing, but we haven't seen that yet.
Your newspaper today had a letter from the Kinder Morgan, the operator of the pipeline, Ian Anderson's the head, about what he might and might not do. So there were some hints in there of how the company itself is proceeding. What's that all about?
Well, they're basically, the president of Kinder Morgan Canada wrote a letter to Premier John Horgan saying, we're consulting with our lawyers because we don't believe you have a leg to stand on in terms of controlling how much oil goes through a pipeline that crosses a provincial border. That's federal jurisdiction. They're also saying, though, that their investors in this pipeline are getting weary of all the delays, and they've already fought Burnaby on the permits and dragging out permits. They didn't challenge BC on the permits, interestingly, because all through the political demonstration of opposition to the pipeline, the BC government's still approving permits as required, so there's no evidence that they've actually done anything to stop the pipeline in terms of the bureaucratic day-to-day stuff.
The federal government, I saw a CBC story yesterday that said the federal government is determined to protect its jurisdiction, but they don't believe they can take British Columbia to court on this until they have an actual regulation to challenge. Just talking, just consulting isn't enough to drag into court. So this could go on for some time.
It could. And Natural Resources Minister Jim Carr made that point today. There's nothing to intervene in. There's no regulation yet. There's nothing to take to court. So we repeat our view. We have jurisdiction over this. The project has been approved. But until we see something from BC, there's nothing to get into court on in terms of challenging this regulation. We put it to John Horgan yesterday. This could take a year. He dismisses that. He says, no, the work's going to be done. In fact, there's going to be what he called an intentions letter released at the end of this month about what the options they're looking at in terms of bitumen. So that might provide some clarity and more of a sense of a timeline. But I still think the prospect is there for this to drag on for some time yet. And then he raises the question, do Kinder Morgan's investors and board of directors become weary and lose patience and suddenly say we're walking away? Ian Anderson says no, they're going to stick around, but he has to say that. But if this keeps dragging out like this, you have to wonder.
Take their $7.4 billion and go somewhere else where it might be more welcome. Very quickly, the government has done something almost every day this week, and today was no exception. They've done something every day this week. And today it was the minimum wage is going up on an announced schedule, not immediately, not all at once, but starting June, and then continuing through to 2021.
Right.
So it's going to hit $15.
Yeah, and I think a little bit in excess of 15 by 2021. But you've obviously got people that have been pushing for a $15 minimum wage for some time, expressing disappointment that the government's not moving faster. Okay. But it's also interesting, the timing. I wonder if, John Horgan, we heard him say to us yesterday, he doesn't want to get distracted by this little trade dispute with Alberta, and he's busy doing other things, and suddenly they've got lots of other things to talk about. I'm sure they'll keep the pace up next week as well with the throne speech. So they really do want to change the channel in terms of this argument with Alberta, although I wonder if they will have to do something to help BC wineries in this. It's a $70 million annual hit if this carries on. There is a trade agreement in place between Alberta and BC and the Western provinces that's supposed to prevent these kinds of disputes, and there's a dispute mechanism. There's $5 million penalty.
This thing we call TILMA?
It used to be called TILMA. It's now the New West Trade Partnership.
Oh, okay. Very
Because
good.
I brought in Manitoba. Thank you. I've been reading up on this. So there is a mechanism there, and BC might have a right to go and at least to use that mechanism and say we need Alberta to stop this.
Meanwhile, over on the other channel, the BC Liberals got themselves a new leader on the weekend. Here he is, Andrew Wilkinson.
We have a lot of work to do. We have to fight back the NDP's idea of a payoff to the Green Party, which is proportional representation. We have to make sure all British Columbians are represented in government, not just a select few of the NDP's friends. And we have to make sure that British Columbians feel that excitement of living in this wonderful place so that they can get ahead in life and make sure their kids have the same opportunities that we did.
You were live on the floor of that convention, Mr. Baldrey, and even though it was all compressed into about 90 minutes, it was pretty exciting stuff.
Yeah, it was pretty dramatic. I didn't have Andrew Wilkinson winning on the fifth ballot or the fifth count, but I don't think anybody really had a clear grasp of exactly what was going to happen. It was dramatic. Wilkinson won. I think there was a lot of surprise over how the Diane Watts didn't grow, even though she led on the first ballot. She really didn't take off. Todd Stone had some controversy just on the eve of the voting, and I think that cost him with some of the voters, some of the members. But Wilkinson now is in place, and it's going to be interesting. He's a very smart guy. He's a doctor and a lawyer and a Rhodes Scholar, just for good measure. But even by his own admission, he's got some work to do on the retail side of politics to sell himself to the average folks out there. He told me on the eve of entering the race that he knew that people thought he was arrogant and elitist and out of touch and such. And I think he has to work on getting over those hurdles to be a successful counterpoint to John Horgan. But don't underestimate him if you're the NDP. I mean, he's a smart guy. He's a very good communicator. And I think you're going to see the Liberals now finally get out of this slumber, these doldrums that the party's been in since that loss last summer. They've now got a new leader. They've got a new staff that was announced today. Presumably they're going to have different priorities and be a little more focused than they have been up until now.
Any immediate challenges you see for him?
Well, the immediate thing is obviously just the fact that the party was very close to choosing a leader who didn't have any baggage with the last 16 years of government. Andrew Wilkinson brings with him a record of being at the cabinet table. So if you're concerned about your ICBC rates going up, or you're unhappy about the result out of the Site C dam going ahead because the previous government got it past the point of no return, if you're unhappy about any of those things, it's all going to come back to him. So he has limited in his ability to attack the government on some of those issues. I think proportional representation is the idea of having a referendum on democratic reform is going to be a huge issue for them, because it will have probably more implications for the Liberal Party. If
their party could split in two.
Yeah, and so holding together the coalition under that free enterprise tent will be a challenge.
I noticed that in his victory speech, he said it's time to stop referring to whether or not we're Liberals and Conservatives and just be BC Liberals from now on, and never mind our federal connections, even though in any leadership race, everybody knows who everybody was and where they were on federal election night in 2015. So, yeah, I think you're right about that. In the last week, we also lost a great British Columbia politician, one who, if you've been watching this show for a long time, gave one of his last interviews here way back in 2006. Dave Barrett, there he is.
You had a chance to cover it.
Yeah. He was a force of nature, the most electrifying politician I've seen speak. He had an incredible populist style, and he could turn on a dime from heaping just scorn and indignation on his opponents to having his audience roar with laughter because he switched to ridiculing them. And Keith, for a guy who was premier for just a little over 3 years, 3 years and about 4 months, he left a hell of a legacy.
Oh, a whirlwind of legislation. I mean, W.C. Bennett is always sort of the gold standard for premiers, but he was premier for 20 years. Dave Barrett, I would say, equals his legacy in terms of legislation achievement, and he was only premier for a little more than 3 years. And it was a ton of landmark legislation that remains on the books to this day. Everything from the Agricultural Land Reserve to ICBC, the ambulance service, the reforms of the legislature here, Hansard, a question period. There was no question period until Barrett came along. Pharmacare, still with us to this day. And even things like, because I remember as a kid, this was sort of a big deal, banning the strap in schools and banning corporal punishment. I mean, it seems ludicrous today that we used to have the strap, but yeah, it was one of the things the Barrett government brought in, lowering the drinking age to 19, establishing neighborhood pubs. Really had a far-reaching impact on many British Columbians' lives and lasted to this day. Robson set the wheels in motion, Cypress Bowl.
Yeah, we're still waiting, Justine, to find out. There'll probably be some sort of a memorial for Barrett. They're talking about one in the capital and maybe a political one in Vancouver too. But I think there certainly will be some sort of thing. And Charlie Smith in the Georgia Straight had a piece saying, we probably should try to figure out something to name after him because, we've got hydroelectric dams and bridges and all kinds of stuff named after premiers.
Well,
maybe
the Site C dam is going to need a name.
I don't think he wants that one.
Yeah, no, I don't think he'd look for that. But it's an interesting idea, and I think probably you'll see that as well. You didn't get to cover him. I don't think you did. Yeah, there was even in the 90s, he used to still show up at NDP conventions and give these speeches. The party would bring him in every time they needed to be rescued on some issue.
That's right, and some of the conventions around no-fault insurance, which is now coming back in another form right now, and on the 6 Mile Ranch, on the Agricultural Land Reserve reforms. So I did get to see him, and as he described himself as an old ghost coming back to participate in politics again, I remember going, did he say old ghost or old goat? And I think I actually had to ask him because I wasn't really sure. But when you look at the pictures in the hall of the legislature, and it's all these portraits of the premiers, and it's all these black and white, very serious people staring at you. And then there's this picture of Barrett. Yeah. And he looks,
beams of light.
Yeah, it looks like he's on the Price of Right set. The Price is Right. It's all these colors and everything. And it was really a mark of the time that he ushered in a dramatic change in the province and its direction.
He collected Tiffany lamps, and that's a Tiffany lamp. Someone, a New Democrat, told me this, that they took the picture of him sitting in front of it. It makes it look, and Derek Barrett thought this was hilarious, that it made it look like he had beams of light shooting out of his head. Let's go on, because there's so much stuff going on that we just got to keep moving on here. David Eby started the week, our Attorney General, with a press conference on ICBC. Here he is.
What we want to do is provide British Columbians with a realistic assessment of what is possible, the changes that we think we can deliver by April 1st of 2019. And we are taking a very conservative approach with ICBC to make sure that, first of all, the insurer is back on track financially, because we can't afford to have these massive losses at the insurer. And secondly, to let British Columbians know that the insurer is in real trouble and we need to get it back on its feet. And these changes are significant, but they won't be the only changes that are necessary.
So the big significant change is being called No Fault Light. Justine, you and I and Keith all covered an NDP convention in the 1990s where the government then was talking about no fault, and they had to back off because they lost the public relations battle. It does take, I think, a certain amount of guts for the NDP to go back into this.
Yeah, well, they don't use the words. He never used the word no fault throughout that whole press conference. And Joy McPhail, who's now the chair of ICBC, former cabinet minister who was part of the government that tried to bring in these reforms in the 1990s, recalled how they went off the rails by trying to bring it in without any kind of they didn't bring the groups that were involved, the stakeholders, along, which she said they did very carefully.
Give people the overview of the sort of the trade-off that they did this time.
So essentially we're saying they're going to cap the amount of money that people can get on a small minor injury for pain and suffering, and that the trade-off that will save, they say, $1 billion a year. But they're also allowing for about $200 million a year in additional payouts for treating pain and injuries as a result of, or lost income as a result of an injury. The idea of no fault comes in because they'll now be able to treat, they'll say whether you were at fault or not, you will still be eligible for those additional medical payouts. The interesting thing, though, I think, is that they're not bringing these changes in for more than a year. So the savings are a long way off. In the meantime, ICBC is hemorrhaging money. We know they're expected to hit a $1.3 billion deficit this year. The deficit will probably be even larger next year at this rate. So they're still going to have to bring in some measures soon, or else they're going to have to raise rates, or they're going to be looking to the Treasury for some kind of bailout.
Even before the government announced this cap on settlements, the trial lawyers in the province had started advertising, attacking ICBC, saying this is what they're going to do, which was right. So they had inside knowledge, is my guess. But how do you see the political battle? Can the government win it this time?
I think they can. I've talked to a couple of cabinet ministers who were there in the party in the 90s who said, yeah, I think we've got our ducks in a row this time better. And we were also making the case that ICBC is this fiscal dumpster fire. And the public knows that significant action has to take place here. The lawyers are clearly the big losers here. I mean, the whole goal to David Eby's exercise, and he's pretty blunt about this, we have to cut down on legal costs. The amount of money that is going out for lawyers and things associated with people filing lawsuits is enormous, and it's grown exponentially the last few years. As the number of accidents keep going up, 20,000 a year, every year there's more accidents. A lot of them rear-enders because of distracted driving and such. So litigation costs are just spiraling upwards. They have to be controlled. And this is not complete no fault. It's no fault light, and there's going to be, some birthing pains in this, but I think the public will get their heads around it. I
thought a very good technical presentation for the press gallery put on by ICBC this week, and laid it all out. One number that jumped out at me is that ICBC is paying out the claims payout. They're paying out 24% of the money goes to legal costs. Only 20% goes to those minor injuries. So the lawyers are getting more money than the people that are injured, and I think with that leverage the government can win this one. As I said, I give the NDP credit for trying to deal with it. It's clear that the previous Liberal government left quite a mess at the books of the Insurance Corporation of BC. It lost $900 million last year, $1.3 billion in the year we're in, and as Justine said, it's probably going to lose another $1 billion before they finally get things under control. On that note, we'll take a brief break on Voice of BC. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
So
So I believe the NDP used up a lot of the goodwill of their environmentally minded voting base by announcing Site C Dam to proceed. This has greatly outraged a good deal of their Green electorate within the NDP voting base, and I believe that they're going to have to now, to try to win it back, make great progress in announcing expansion of old-growth forest protection, in curtailing fish farms, in undertaking a lot more environmental initiatives around climate change. This is my prediction. Otherwise, I think the NDP is toast.
Hi, I'm George Abbott, recovering politician. When I'm looking for answers, where should I look? Should I look to American television, CNN? In the day of fake news, I think there's only one place that you can look for good, reliable answers. That's Voice of BC with Vaughn Palmer.
Where there are no bars, there's freedom. It's where we find the strongest connections. And power we never knew we had. It's not always easy. And sometimes you wonder what you got yourself into. But when the stars are your compass, you tend to find your way.
There are more ways to connect with us at Voice of BC. Email us at vobc@shaw.ca. Follow us on Twitter at Voice of BC. Or like us on Facebook at facebook.com/VOBC on Shaw TV.
Premier Horgan has been promoting LNG on his recent trip to Asia, which contradicts his commitment to climate action. Fracking and exporting liquefied fracked gas will increase climate impacts around the province, making things worse like the wildfires we saw last summer. The LNG Canada project alone will make it impossible to meet BC's emission reduction targets. This government was elected on a commitment to real climate action. Promoting LNG takes us in the opposite direction.
Welcome back to Voice of BC, and as I said, the government's done something every day this week worth talking about. Here we go, Bill Thielman commenting on the announcement that they made this week moving forward on how the NDP government in BC is going to implement Canada's coming legalization of recreational cannabis. Here's Bill.
Marijuana Minister Mike Farnworth, that's his new title, has come up with the idea that private liquor stores and government liquor stores will not be able to sell cannabis products. Does this surprise you? I thought it was a pretty good idea for starters, but now it won't happen. And will BCGEU and the private liquor stores be fighting mad?
So we had on this show last fall the head of the BC Government and Service Employees Union and the head of the BC Federation of Labour, and they both made the case that the obvious place to sell marijuana was in government liquor stores. The staff are trained, they're unionized, they're used to turning away kids. They're not going to obviously fall into the clutches of organized crime, and I actually thought they made a pretty good case, but that's not the way the government went. Justine, what happened?
Well, yeah, they're saying they're going to separate liquor from marijuana sales. So there'll be standalone stores selling recreational marijuana, and I think there had been some health concerns raised around the idea of having both of those drugs available in the same shop. So I think that had not been part of the narrative. I heard the same pitch, and it seemed like it made a lot of sense to me as well. And there was an interesting kind of synergy between the private and public liquor stores saying, hey, we're the ones that can do this. But I think in the end they said, no, we were convinced that this is a better way to separate it. It also, I think, gives the municipalities a little more control, because they're going to still have some say over where these stores can go, storefronts. And I think the BC government has been very careful not to force this on municipalities that don't want it. So this will allow them to have a little more control over where those stores go.
There's still a lot of things we don't know.
No, it's there's a lot of shoes ready to drop on this file. I think a big reason it's not in the liquor stores is Dr. Perry Kendall, the Chief Medical Health Officer, just retired last week. He really made a big push from a healthcare perspective. It was not good to retail cannabis next to alcohol. You could have increased impaired driving instances, exposure to young people who can still come in a liquor store with if they're accompanied by an adult. So when I saw his op-ed piece in the Vancouver Sun, actually, I thought, and then talking to Mike Farmer, I started to think, these are good points. And the other one, talking to some liquor store managers over the last few weeks, a lot of them didn't want cannabis in the store. They said physically, I don't think we can accommodate this. We have enough trouble accommodating alcohol in these stores and serving our customers on that. The other thing about the GEU here, Farnworth says there's going to be publicly owned stores.
Yeah.
I think you put the question to him in our news conference. It seems to be logical the GEU will organize those stores, and this will expand the GEU membership into public marijuana stores, public cannabis stores that don't exist up until now. So I think the GEU, they made a pitch. Stephanie Smith, the president, made a pitch, but I think they've got to be happy with the alternative here.
Yeah, and I think the staff will have to be trained in any event and to a pretty high standard. These stores are going to be scrutinized very, very carefully, not just because of the government wanting to make sure the drug doesn't get into the hands of kids, but the stores will be scrutinized to make sure they don't fall into the hands of organized crime. So there's still a lot, but there's still a lot to come on that. I still wonder if the government's going to get everything done by summertime. I know the feds are already talking about, well, sort of this summer, but the stuff may not be on sale till the fall. So
18 pieces of legislation have to come in.
That's a good point. Well, here's Premier John Horgan with the biggest decision, I guess, he's made since becoming Premier, a controversial one. Let's go to the Premier.
I know many of us would wish that the circumstances were different, but I and my colleagues have to accept the situation as we find it, not as how we wish it would be. We have listened, we have deliberated, and we have debated. And at the end of the day, we've come to the conclusion that although Site C is not the project we would have favored, and it's not the project we would have started, it must be completed to meet the objectives our government has set through mandate letters to ministers and commitments to the people of BC during the election campaign.
We've had one opinion poll since then that suggested that the overall British Columbia public accepted this decision. There's a fairly entrenched opposition, mostly New Democrats, that are still furious over this.
It was a pivotal decision. I think it's the defining decision of this government and will be for some time. What they did on Site C was going to say so much about which direction they were headed in. If they were going to go give completely up to the environmental movement and do everything that Greenpeace wants them to do, they would have killed Site C. They had to establish some street cred, I think, on the economic side and with the business community, and play the centrist card rather than the activist card. And that's how one cabinet minister described this to me. This was pragmatic realism, where and Horgan told me this at our year-end interview, that we've got to get rid of our history of activism and start governing for all British Columbians. And I think that was reflective in the decision on Site C. You saw Ken Wu in the break there saying the NDP is dead if they make decisions like this. But I think the NDP would be seriously harmed if they just went down the environmental side of every single issue and said no to everything. I don't think the public's there with that, and a series of public opinion polls confirms that.
The risk that I see in this one, Justine, is not so much the hard time they're going to get from their own supporters who can't accept, this kind of thing. Understandably, some of them thought the government was going to kill this. The problem with Site C is that the project isn't finished yet. The current budget figure may not be the last one we get. There's still all kinds of engineering concerns, and I know you've written about it. We're waiting for the next big contract there, and it's another controversial contract at this point.
Yeah, and so this would be the second largest contract out of this entire project. Just now they're saying $10 billion, but we're waiting. And it sounds like they have gone through a couple of rounds of bidding, which suggests to me that they weren't getting the prices that they had hoped to get. They won't tell us the details because they don't want to give away how much they had been prepared to spend. But if they're having this much trouble getting that second contract secured, so they have now chosen the preferred bidders. So there's a consortium, and it includes a company there's some controversy the federal government is reviewing because
the Chinese are trying to buy it.
Yes, and so if the federal government, Hydro is going to be making a decision to award this contract before the federal government's decided whether or not the Chinese ownership is a problem under Canadian law. That's going to be contentious just by itself. But yeah, the risk to the project of it going off and costing more, I think is very real, and everything now that goes wrong is going to land on John Horgan's shoulders, not the previous administration.
And construction completion is still a long way off. They don't even start to divert the river. Is it 2020 now?
Yeah, it's been pushed back a year.
And there's some thought that, it might be another year. So this thing is going to be with us for a long time. The electricity, if all goes well, will be delivered toward the end of 2024. So we'll have an election in 2021, and we'll be almost to the next election after that. So anyway, I agree with Keith's analysis, but I would say there was also a hell of a lot of risk-taking here on the part of the government, because this is not the end of the Site C story. There's still a long way to go on it. Let's go to now we have to go to this one, because this raises the issue of the NDP's partner in power sharing, Andrew Weaver and the Greens, and their reaction to Site C. So here's Jamie Lawson out of the University of Victoria.
What is Andrew Weaver's calculation in continuing to support the NDP after the controversial decision to go ahead with Site C? Is his view that he can really anticipate some much better outcomes in environmental files going forward? Or is it that he, above all else, really needs to have proportional representation in place before he wants to go to another election?
So Weaver opposed Site C, but he didn't make it a condition of his power sharing deal. And when Horgan approved it, he said, I'm not going to bring the government down over this. He opposes LNG, and that's not exactly spelled out in his power sharing agreement either, but he now says he will, who knows, bring down the government over LNG, right?
Yeah, so when they came up with that, the negotiations between the Greens and the Liberals and the Greens and the NDP, Andrew Weaver kept saying one of the top demands was around a vote on electoral reform. And I remember asking, I thought you were all about climate action, and but it was all about getting that vote.
Because if he gets proportional representation, it strengthens the Greens' seat count in the legislature.
Yeah, and it allows them to build a legacy that's right now far from certain. So I thought that was what was going on with Site C. He had deliberately left it alone and left it out of the calculation because he had his eye on this vote, and he was going to allow this minority government to stand at least until voters later this fall have a chance to decide whether or not they want to change our voting system. So when he came out with his comments around LNG, the Premier had gone to Asia and he was meeting with investors in potential LNG projects in BC. I was a bit surprised that he was suddenly willing to bring down the government over conversations about investment on projects that may or may not happen. So we'll see as we go forward. But he said at that point that was the most important thing, was climate action, and that LNG doesn't fit with that plan. Government's response is they say we don't really know what the impact of LNG will be on our greenhouse gas emissions, and we're working on it, so wait.
I would suggest that perhaps the most anxious job in the BC government is the poor person that has to deal with Andrew Weaver every day.
Yes, Donna Sanford, the liaison between the two. Andrew Weaver, he changes his mind. Justine's right. In the Rose Garden this summer, he made it clear proportional representation was his number one issue. Yeah. He has since said, he was in my office when he got back from Palm Springs, where he was madly tweeting by poolside that he was going to bring the government down, and everybody was getting excited. And he came back and said, no, my whole life has been about climate change and climate modeling, and no, this is the number one issue for me. So he says if LNG rears its head in BC with the assistance of the NDP government, he would vote against the government in a confidence vote. I'm not convinced that means his entire Green Caucus is going to vote against the NDP over that issue. This is right now, all of the evidence I've seen is this is just Andrew Weaver talking, and we don't know whether he's going to follow through with this or not. But clearly he says LNG now is the big issue to them because he doesn't think they can meet the targets.
Not every vote in the legislature is a confidence vote. In fact, there are only 2 that are, and those are not going to be votes on LNG.
They're not votes on LNG. Now he can decide that I'm voting against the government on a confidence vote because of a surprise. He regards courting LNG. He told me it's a surprise, and a surprise is clearly identified in the agreement that that's an out to vote against. We're a long way from that. There's no LNG in sight. So the first confidence vote this spring on the budget, Andrew Weaver's going to support it.
And we had a briefing this week on the LNG industry, and our understanding is you might have a final investment decision on 1 or 2 projects this fall, but that doesn't even mean they would go ahead right away, and nobody's saying the decision on a final investment decision would be yes. There's still a couple of projects that are on the shelf here, but they're not going ahead at the moment. So I think we're quite a ways away from LNG and voting in the BC legislature. We do, however, next week have a throne speech on Tuesday, and the following Tuesday a budget. Question about the budget, Andrew McLeod of the Tyee.
The government has been in power a little more than 6 months now, and for most of the time, the answer on a lot of questions has been, we're working on it and wait for our budget. So that budget is coming now in February, and I'm wondering what you're expecting in it. What do you need to see there?
So this is where the government gets real, I think, with the budget.
And John Horgan's told us yesterday the top priorities are childcare and the whole affordability issue, childcare and housing. So we expect some money to be there to address those 2 areas. But Carol James, keep in mind, every time she talks about the $10 a day childcare and the housing commitment, it's over 10 years. So this is a 10-year program. So this is year 1 we're going to see in February. So I don't think the amount of money is going to be dramatic. I don't think we're talking billions of dollars, but we're probably hundreds of millions of dollars. And I think those are the 2 big checklists, I think, that we're going to be keeping an eye on when she tables her first budget. But, you know, it's got to have some revenue problems. She just blew a big hole in her budget by cutting MSP premiums in half. That's more than $1 billion out. I would expect property purchase revenues are going down, not up. And I see BC's worsening financial situation. I don't think she's got a lot of maneuverability here to do some big ticket things right away.
But I think the public has been patient so far, and the government's done well so far, but I think they're going to have to start making progress on some of these big files.
Yeah, no, they're going to have something concrete, and I think the throne speech next week will have some concrete promises, or at least fleshing out where they're going to go on things like daycare, which was a big issue in the election, and that was one of the things that helped win them support in the Lower Mainland, which critically tipped the balance in their favor. So they will need to do something on that. I think ICBC, but also BC Hydro's finances are going to be one of the 2 millstones around this budget. Because there's huge financial problems there, and Site C will add to those problems, by the way. They're going to have to recognize that and figure out how to get through that without threatening BC's credit rating. But so far, the business community is being patient, and the province's credit rating has been solid. And so they've managed to get through those initial reviews without frightening investors and bringing the province to its economic knees, as the Liberals always prophesied.
No, you're right, the credit agencies, but everyone's giving them a chance. One of the most interesting reactions I got about the government was interviewed former Cabinet Minister Bill Bennett during the convention on the Vancouver Sun Facebook site, and I said, give John Horgan a letter grade for his performance so far. He said B+. Mm-hmm. And that's a Liberal. But Bill is a straight shooter as well, and I think actually that's probably, not every Liberal would admit it publicly, but I think there's a lot of people out there that would go, yeah, so far so good. B+, that's not bad for a new premier, especially when you consider how bumpy some new people are in office, the kind of things that go wrong for them. So next Wednesday, the by-election day? Wednesday.
February 14th.
Yeah, February the 14th, Valentine's Day. The people of the Okanagan are going to vote to fill the vacant seat in the legislature, the one that Christy Clark gave up, Kelowna West. Let's go to the Green Party for a comment on that, and we'll just get a call on the by-election. Here's Christina Winter.
A recent poll shows that almost 3 in 10 British Columbians support the BC Green Party, with gains in support since the last provincial election coming mainly from the interior, where the BC Greens have replaced the NDP as the alternative to the BC Liberal Party. How do you think that this increase in support for the BC Greens will play out in the Kelowna West by-election on February 14th, where Robert Stupka is committed to winning the support of voters and offering the Okanagan a new voice in Victoria as the BC Greens' 4th MLA?
Well, the Greens are putting on a big push up there. Andrew Weaver's been up campaigning a few times. The New Democrats have done a little bit of campaigning. And the Liberals are running a former Liberal MLA, Ben Stewart. He was the member until he gave up the seat for Christy Clark. I wonder if this wine thing is going to have any impact.
Well, I think Ben Stewart's doing his very best to make sure it does. So he
owns a winery himself, right?
And
so he might know
this is wine country, and you've just got Alberta now threatening the industry. The industry is very concerned about this. It's 70 million. Alberta is the second largest consumer of BC wines. So boycotting BC wines in Alberta is going to have a huge hit for those industries. So Ben Stewart's going to be out there saying the NDP government of BC, John Horgan's government, brought this down on you, and you guys are getting caught in the crossfire. I'm sure he'll. And it's also, look, it's very solid Liberal constituency. It would obviously be fascinating for all of us here in the press gallery if the Greens won another seat, because that would be just such an interesting dynamic to cover. So
major upset for the Greens to win that seat, though. I
but
think
we've both said this already, that from the point of view of an interesting storyline to write about, proportional representation would generate a whole new political arena to write about in British Columbia. So and we're already seeing it. I mean, you had a piece on this saying that the way Weaver's acting with his threats to bring down the government may plant in the public's mind a notion that proportional representation, if we get this regularly, is not necessarily a recipe for stability.
No, and Weaver, this is the contradiction of what Weaver's been doing, talking about bringing down the government. He's creating this atmosphere of instability and not knowing from month to month whether the government is going to survive, even though, as I pointed out, there's not going to be a confidence vote anytime soon. But he's leaving that impression. So he has to be careful about going too far in terms of staking out his position, which means defeating the government.
One more break on Voice of BC, and we'll be back with one last segment. And what are we going to do? We're going to talk about road pricing, among other things. Stay with us.
Well, the John Horgan government recently announced a new plan to try and delay the Kinder Morgan pipeline expansion project. A reading of the Canadian Constitution, specifically Section 9210A, suggests that the Government of Canada has complete and unfettered jurisdiction over interprovincial pipelines. Ottawa also has control over protection of the marine environment. In light of that, one strategy for the company may be to proceed with the project and force the NDP to go to court to try and stop it. In that scenario, there's a high likelihood the courts would actually side with Ottawa and the company and indicate that the provincial government doesn't have authority on this file.
Hi, I'm Paul Ramsey, retired politician and retired political pundit. If you're looking for answers about what's going on in Victoria, if you're trying to figure out who's doing what in the madhouse of our legislature, my recommendation is that you tune in to Voice of British Columbia with Vaughn Palmer. You'll find some answers, and you get stimulated and more involved in our province's politics.
I had a spinal cord injury when I was 17 years old, so it was a major life transition for myself and for my family. But as I got into school and I started studying psychology at the university, I really fell in love with it. That's when I connected with Make a Change Canada, and they helped me to turn that passion into a career. And now I'm really happy as a registered psychologist helping others.
Make a Change Canada is an accredited non-profit organization with charitable status. Find out how they may be able to empower you with your employment challenges.
This was some Christmas break for you three. What with the ICBC dumpster fire, Andrew Weaver's huffery-puffery over LNG, the big Asia trip for the Premier, Andrew Wilkinson's leadership win, and of course the Alberta-BC Civil War. Do you see what happens when you three take a little time off?
When you look ahead at the political horizon, you realize there's just a whole series of tough decisions for the government, one after another. It's partly the nature of governing, it's partly the New Democrats coming into office with a different agenda, and it's partly that the previous government left a lot of stuff to be dealt with. And all of that comes together in some of the things facing the NDP. Here's a good question. One of the big decisions that's going to be made sooner or later from Bruce Halser. About road pricing. Here's Bruce.
Sometime this year, the Mobility Pricing Independent Commission will issue a report to the Greater Vancouver mayors, and they're probably going to recommend some kind of road pricing, which is probably going to require provincial legislation. Is the party that got rid of the tolls on bridges going to be comfortable bringing in a bigger toll system on roads and mobility pricing generally? Or do you think that the NDP government will just use the fact that it's in a minority to say that this is too difficult an issue for now?
So the region needs a new source of funding to pay for its share of operating costs and of the capital costs for 2 transit lines that they want to build, one in Vancouver, one in Surrey, and probably to help pay for the replacement of the Patello Bridge as well, since it was going to be a toll bridge, but we know what happened to the idea of toll bridges in BC. So what are they going to do with this thing?
Well, Bruce's point about them being in a minority situation, therefore we can't really push this at this time, is a good one. They have to look for an excuse and out here because they got elected because they scrapped the tolls on the Port Mann Bridge and the Golden Ears Bridge. I think that was the standout issue in some of those key suburban ridings that fell into the NDP's hands. I think the mayors of Metro have to take ownership of this for it to have any chance of succeeding. Victoria alone...
In an election year, the mayors are going to take ownership?
This is why I think this is almost dead on arrival, because I don't think the mayors will stick their heads up saying, yeah, I champion taxing motorists even more. Even though it can make a lot of sense public policy-wise, it's done in other jurisdictions, but they've got to make the brave step here of taking political ownership of something that's going to be unpopular. And whether this year's an election year, so forget it, it's not going to happen this year. Does it happen next year with a new set of mayors, a new set of council? Maybe that's when you can breathe some life into it. But I can't see John Horgan at the same time he's talking about trying to make life more affordable for people in Metro Vancouver, to sign his name onto some legislation that allows a road pricing system that's going to cost people money. It just seems dead on arrival.
They start jacking up the carbon tax on the 1st of April. Is there enough money coming in from the carbon tax that they can put some of that into this?
Well, I think they're planning, they've already earmarked that. They probably spent it 3 times over. Yeah, it's supposed to go to the provincial share of putting in for transit, so they don't want to share that with the mayors. I mean, they might find some creative way working with ICBC to come up with some kind of congestion pricing. And
ICBC's rolling in dough.
Yeah, but you know, it sort of say you've got to create a crisis in the public's mind before you're going to be able to present any kind of remedy that's uncomfortable. We do know that the government said no, they're not going to do another referendum. They've ruled out that idea that was floated by the Liberal government. So somebody has to make a decision somewhere along the line, and that's you can't dump it on the voters again. That's the problem they've created.
That's a really tough one. So we mentioned this a couple of times. It's coming in the fall, but let's let Bernard von Schulman ask a question about it, and then we'll talk a little bit about where things stand with this referendum. Here is Bernard von Schulman.
A big issue during this year is going to be the referendum and proportional representation. 2 questions here is, what do you think the final question will look like that is put in front of the public? And do you think there's any realistic chance that the referendum will pass?
I think it could pass because the government's doing everything they possibly can to make sure that it does pass and to stack the deck in favor of that. But the problem with talking about it, and we'll give Keith and Justine both a chance, is that we don't know what will be the question or questions. There's a lot of stuff still to be rolled out on this, and it's very hard to figure out where the NDP's going on this.
Yeah, it likely will be, do you want to change, and if so, which change do you want? And then we get into all these different models that are none of them easy to explain. And at the
Go
same
on.
time,
Piece of
I've
cake.
tried. And then you've got people like Bill Thielman, who has proven to be a formidable opponent and is very good at delivering no's on referendums up against whoever the government's going to work with on this. So I wouldn't venture a guess on whether it's going to pass, but I do think we need to see the questions to see whether or not the government can sell it.
Tillman has, I think, made one very good point so far, which is the fairness issue. If it really looks like they're pushing it and stacking it, it could blow up in their face.
Government. And as Justine says, Bill's very good at this. He's won these campaigns before. He's out there every day on social media, news releases. He's in as much media as he can, making the point over and over again. One of the things he's really emphasizing is if there's a perceived unfairness of this, and it has been criticized already for stacking the deck in favor of a change. That questionnaire, you can go online and check out what the questions are. You don't fill it out once, but I thought the questions were very heavily geared towards making you want to go to a proportional representation model, and that somehow the status quo was not very good. And little things like that, and depending on the question from David Eby, I think leaves the impression that, or could leave the impression this is unfairly stacked for one outcome that the government is desiring. The other thing I've heard talked about, will anybody challenge it in court if there's a perceived an outcome that seems to favor the government's position on changing the voting system? Is that, and certainly there have been some lawyers I've seen nationally say that could be a path for someone to take through a court challenge, saying this is not how you change a voting system just because a government wants it. And the NDP's tipped its hand, it wants a change.
But I think your point about Andrew Weaver and what happens with the minority government over the next few months will also have a huge influence on voters' impressions, because up until this issue with LNG and Andrew Weaver, the NDP and the Greens were working very hard to present a government that can work, and minority governments can work. That's been the mantra, and they were doing a pretty good job of that. And then when you suddenly start throwing out, sitting on Twitter announcing that you're planning to bring down the government, that didn't probably help their cause. So I think that watching how that unfolds over the session will be probably influential.
One of the things I find interesting is the things that you see people on social media and people that are advocating for this change make, and the examples they point to. And they often talk about how first past the post results in governments that don't represent the majority of all voters. They don't represent what the public wants. And yet, and Tillman was the first guy to point this out, the province's 3 NDP governments in the past were all won majority of the seats in the legislature with about 40% of the vote. You know, you've heard many, many New Democrats in the last week, rightly, and people who weren't New Democrats, pay tribute to Dave Barrett and all the things his government accomplished. He did that with about 39% of the popular vote. One of the smallest shares of popular vote in provincial history under first past the post. So first past the post can produce some pretty good governments, occasionally bad ones, but I'm not sure the proportional representation is a perfect record anyway. We're in for a big debate on this. As I said, I think it could pass, but I think we're also in for a big debate. And as we said, Andrew Wilkinson, in his acceptance speech the other night, said the Liberal Party is going to spend the summer getting ready for this battle. It's a by mail ballot in the fall, right? So we'll have some time to vote about it, but we don't know the questions. There's a lot of stuff we don't know yet. Time for a couple more questions before we go. Here's Bruce Halser again. This is another decision. The government's put this one off, but they're going to have to decide at some point. Here's Bruce.
Over the holidays, there was a lot of discussion about Uber and Lyft and ride sharing generally. And what we have is something that the vast majority of British Columbians want, and one industry vociferously opposes. Which side will the NDP choose, and when will that happen?
I lead such a sheltered life, I've never used one of these services.
Well, because it's not actually available here. I had a house guest from Ottawa on the weekend, and the first thing he remarked was, well, where's Uber here? Because that's a perfectly normal thing in other jurisdictions. So yeah, so far the NDP government has really listened to what the taxi industry, and that's who he's alluding to as the one stakeholder that's very opposed to any change. I am told once they have finished that review of looking at the taxi industry, they will look at Uber, and I think it's probably going to be here in some form because it's already here in an unregulated form to some degree.
That was fascinating. There's like
Yeah.
There's 4 or 5 companies out there that are running.
You just have to know where to look.
So this all-party committee is going to finish up its work at the end of this month and file a report. They've had some hearings. I think that'll go a long ways to shaping final public policy. But keep in mind, we were talking about cannabis earlier. Mike Farnworth, the House Leader of the NDP, has made it clear to his colleagues, we don't have enough legislative time on the calendar to do much other than cannabis and the bills that come with the budget, maybe a couple of other exceptions. I don't think
we're the ICBC legislation.
ICBC as well. So I don't see Uber legislation this spring. Maybe next fall, and maybe as an exposure, and it comes into effect a year from now. So I think we're going to get Uber. I think the NDP is going to be dragged kicking and screaming through the objectations from the taxi industry, which is very firmly entrenched in both political parties. But I think their day is done. I think this is coming, but it's just going to take longer than people want.
Bill Tillman with a couple of unanswered questions out of the BC Liberal Convention. Here's the first one. Bill?
Keith and Justine, Diane Watts came a close second in the race for BC Liberal leader. Do you expect someone to give up a seat, maybe Rich Coleman, and allow her to run and get into the legislature? Or do you expect her to pack up, walk away from it, and do something else altogether, leave the BC Liberals alone?
Well, Wilkinson says he wants her to be an MLA for the Liberals.
Yeah, well, they'd have to pick a very safe seat, and she has profile in Surrey, so they would have to have an MLA probably in Surrey step down.
What are they down to in Surrey now? They lost a bunch of their Surrey seats, right?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of who they
got
would
White
have
Rock.
Stephanie Cadieux, they've got Tracy Reddy's, they've got Marvin Hunt.
So they got 3 seats.
So do any of them want to step aside for somebody? Now, she did come very close.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you know, the voters didn't choose her and the Liberal membership didn't choose her as their leader. I think she'll have to decide how much she wants to be a part of this party that she hadn't really expressed much interest in before this job
She
came
gave up her federal seat, right?
Mm-hmm.
She doesn't have a political job at the moment.
Yep.
But somebody's got to be willing to do that. And I asked the first question to Andrew Wilkinson after the vote, and the first question was, will you ask any senior member of your caucus to step down to let Diane Watts join you on this stage in the caucus? And he basically gave a non-answer. Shirley Bond came up to me afterwards and accused me of looking at her when I asked the question. I said, no, it's not you. But she's not giving up her seat, she says. So I can't see anybody walking away.
But the BC Liberals do have a fresh faces problem. They have an awful lot of members that have the seat because they've always had the seat and they control the riding association. But they need renewal. So anyway. That's an issue. I said there were 2 questions from Tillman out of that convention. Here's the other one.
After his very strong performance in the BC Liberal leadership campaign, rookie MLA Michael Lee is rumored to be thinking about running for mayor of Vancouver. I find it kind of hard to believe that he could leave a year after being elected, but what's your view? Is that a rumor that's making the rounds in Victoria as well?
Well, it's a rumor, but let's talk about Michael Lee for a minute, because this time last year, there's still probably a lot of people in BC who haven't heard of him, but he was just elected last May, and he actually took the most votes early in the Liberal voting, but because it was weighted regionally, he didn't win. He finished 3rd. But this guy ran a pretty impressive campaign.
He ran a very impressive campaign. He was very good in the debate that I chaired. He did. And I actually thought he was going to win on Saturday. I thought, looking at the balloting, it looked like he had the numbers. But Wilkinson had the momentum from count to count. He was really growing, and Lee sort of stalled a bit. But Wilkinson only beat him by 31 points on the critical 4th ballot. And it could have very easily been Michael Lee winning that leadership. This rumor has been around for some time. Lee has been asked about it. He's denied it over and over again. I have a hard time seeing him throwing away what looks to be a very promising provincial political career. He's in a fairly safe seat in Vancouver-Langara. It's very hard for the NDP to win there. He's got a seat for a long time. If the Liberals ever get into power, he's going to be a cabinet minister. So, and the unsureness of going to the Vancouver mayoralty race when the NPA has no evidence that it's organized a political machine of any semblance to the old, it's a big gamble for Lee to give up a safe seat for a very shaky proposition of running for mayor.
He's an unknown quantity too, Justine, in the legislature because he didn't take one of the major critic roles. Instead, he concentrated on running for his campaign. So, I mean, we haven't even scrummed him very often or talked to him that often over here.
Well, what was funny, I talked to a reporter that was there for the Globe, and he asked 3 times right after the leadership, so you're not going to run for mayor, right? And 3 times he declined to answer the question, so maybe he's just having some fun, but maybe after this race he's feeling like he might be looking for something else. Who knows? Let's keep the rumor going.
I don't know. I think the voters have to start taking a dim view of people who get elected at one job and immediately step down and start running for another one, although they do get away with it sometimes. We've covered a lot of ground tonight. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Baldrey, for being on the show.
Good to be here.
Justine, good to have you on the show
Always
again.
Fun.
And folks, next week we're going to be busy on this show because the new leader of the opposition, the new leader of the BC Liberal Party, Andrew Wilkinson, will be on. And as Keith said the other day, the exhibition season is over in the political realm. We're now getting down to the real game, and we're in for a pretty rough year in the legislature this year because we've got new opposition and the government is going to be busy. Thanks for watching Voice of BC, bringing the legislature, BC politics into your living room. Good night.
The following is a community access program. While this program does not necessarily reflect the views of Shaw or its employees, Shaw is proud to support local producers and share local voices, ideas, and opinions. To find out more about community access television, training, and volunteer opportunities, please visit shawtv.ca.